Thank you very much for being here, and welcome to the final closing plenary of Geneva Trade Week. If you are detecting some relief in my voice, that is because it is very much there. But we have had an incredible conference so far, and welcome to this final closing panel, which we are hugely excited about. We will begin that in just a few minutes, but to begin with, I would like to close this part of the conference the same way that I opened it, with some thanks. And in the interest of fairness, I'd like to do those thanks in the chronological order of the way the conference came together. So I'd like to begin by thanking Professors Richard Baldwin and Joost Pauwelyn. This was very much their idea, their vision. About 4 seconds after the WTO announced the closure of the cancellation of the WTO Public Forum, Joost and Richard were on Twitter announcing that we would do this. At the time, there was no we. I don't think the Geneva Trade Platform properly existed yet, but they had a vision and they have had an incredible picture of what they felt this needed to be. And I have to say, any failures of innovation, any way this could have been better, was not a failure of their vision, but rather of my implementation. It was a lot of me saying no by being scared and conservative. So thank you very much for that. Second, I'd like to thank Tamara Pyrénées, the Managing Director of the Center for Trade and Economic Integration. She has been just the most supportive and incredible boss throughout this entire thing, providing us leadership when we needed it, but also rolling up her sleeves and getting down into the trenches with us, shovel in hand, when that was needed too. And you genuinely couldn't ask for more in management. So thank you very much, Tamara. Third, and perhaps most significantly, I'd like to thank our events and communications coordinator, Juanita. This entire conference, all 61 odd sessions of it, every slide, every tweet, every movement of every single person lived entirely within the matrix that is her mind. If this was an orchestra, she is the conductor, and I am the guy off the stage going, play some Chopin. She has been incredible. She has been ably assisted initially by Africa, and throughout the rest of this by Nikki, who is sitting right there. Nikki is the hardest working human being I have ever encountered. She's been relentlessly positive, she's fiercely competent, and was very, very cool about doing anything and everything she was asked to do, despite being by far the smartest and best educated person in the rooms we were in. So thank you very much, Nikki. And like I said, I promised I wouldn't embarrass you, and I don't think I have. Then to Mission Control, Michael, who has been in the ear of every single one of our presenters throughout this entire conference. He has run the mechanics of this conference and the speakers in every session like the most skilled air traffic control operator one can imagine. I think he has won a lot of friends throughout this process, and may now have to never look at a WebEx again. Next, that's kind of our family. I'd like to thank some of those who have helped us deliver this from externally. Our website was put together by a company called Art Joker, who definitely never want to hear from me again. We asked them to do 6 months worth of work in 2 months, and then we kept adding things. They pulled it together right at the very end, and they have been incredible. I want to give a special thank you to Maxim Nazarenko, our project manager, who will block my number in about an hour and a half, but who was fixing code at 2 a.m. Next, I want to thank Global Vision, who are currently pointing cameras at my face and have basically made all of this work. If it wasn't for them, all of the signals would not have left this building. They have been relentlessly professional, relentlessly tireless, and just an absolute pleasure to work with. They've made the sound, the video, and the streams happen. They were the ones who informed us that we cannot actually run a global conference using Wi-Fi and the laptop we bought in college. So thank you very much to Jan and his team, and a special thank you to Jean Contant, who couldn't be here. He's at home, but he has done a tremendous amount of preparation for this conference, including staying up until 3 a.m. to switch us entirely over to Vimeo when we discovered we are so new an organization, YouTube doesn't trust us to stream stuff. Next to Interatio, our translators who have worked to translate, I believe, every single one of our sessions into French and Spanish for the duration of the week. I have done simultaneous translation for 4 minutes, and it was the most exhausting experience of my life. I hope they are looking forward to a well-deserved rest. Finally, though not finally, the events and IT teams here at the Graduate Institute who wired this place for direct broadband when we told them that actually Wi-Fi is not going to work, and who have made this our home for the last week. Thank you so much to Melissa and Hugo at events and IT respectively. And to our graduate students, 7 graduate students from this university have been brilliant. They have been the ones who have been in everyone's ear for every session. They've been the ones who have been changing slides, managing polls, and just doing absolutely everything we could ask for of them all throughout the week. They are far overqualified for what we have asked them to do, and it was honestly just a privilege and a pleasure to watch them work, as well as a grim reminder of the fact that they are far more talented and controlled and frankly professional than I was at their age, or really I am now. And with that, just a final thank you before I hand over to Ambassador Braithwaite to give some final thoughts on the conference and really close us out. And that's to our session organizers and you, the audience. The session organizers stepped up and took a chance on us, and they really helped. They did so along with our partners, the Graduate Institute, Mr. Sergei Popov, the UK Department of International Trade, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation took a massive gamble on this program when it was a cover note and a dream. And I hope they're pleased with what we've been able to put together for them. Our thematic partners, IISD, Cato Trade, Global Trade Alert, and Bertelsmann Foundation also helped immensely. And the Enhanced Integrated Framework alongside Trade Experts, who helped make this a diverse and open and interesting conference in 1,000 different ways. So a tremendous amount of thanks go to them. And finally, to you, the audience. At the start of this conference, I begged you for your patience and engagement. I hope we didn't ask for too much of the former in our delivery, but we were overwhelmed with how much we've got of the latter. So thank you so much for raising your voices, for putting up your hands, for asking questions. It's been everything we hoped for and more. Thank you so much. And with that, I will get off the stage for a moment and hand over to Ambassador Braithwaite of the United Kingdom for some final thoughts to summarize the conference that was. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. And when I was coming here, I was looking at the number of people who have been live streaming these events over this week, and it's 7,500 people. I mean, it's an extraordinary success, and I've been thinking, wow, trade has really got interesting. I was wondering how this had been achieved, and now I know. Dmitry's clearly been keeping you amazingly entertained all week and really bringing to life what is a hugely important set of topics, and I think from what we've seen this week, it's been a fantastic set of events. I mean, it's been brilliant participation. You've been bringing in some really fascinating speakers and bringing it to life in a way that's clearly really captured attention online and in the way in which we've got participation in a way that an event like this wouldn't have got participation in the old days, before COVID-19 and before we actually had to do these sort of hybrid meetings. I mean, there are some silver linings in this crisis we're going through, and one of them is that we're able to reach out in a way that we've never been able to before and bring new people into the conversation. I really want to congratulate the Geneva Trade Platform for doing that this week. It's felt a bit like Geneva Trade Week for me as well, because as some of you may know, we do have a candidate for Director General of the World Trade Organization, and a lot of my week has been literally focused on that. And so I've been bouncing from one sort of WTO and trade-related meeting to another, but it's a real pleasure to come here today and to have participated earlier in the week in this extraordinary innovation, which hopefully will now be a real feature of the Geneva year. Dmitry, you can't go now and just say this is a one-off. We're going to have to do this again, certainly next year and again. And what a week it has been. I mean, there have been over 60 sessions across 5 themes, and these get right to the heart of the questions about the future of the global trading system. And speaking on those topics, we've welcomed so many fascinating speakers from all walks of life, government, business, academia, civil society, and dialing in from innumerable time zones across the world. And I wanted to thank all of those who have participated in that for sharing their insights. As varied as the discussions have been this week, one truth stands out. A fair, inclusive, rules-based international trading system is more critical than ever. Its importance predates COVID-19, obviously, but now as we tackle the most serious public health challenge in a generation, in a century maybe, our collective sense of urgency must increase. We must look at how the multilateral trading system can adapt to help us meet the challenges of the day and urge it to accelerate that transformation. Sustainability has rightly been a key theme of this week, now more important than ever. Many of our discussions have highlighted the need to use trade to tackle climate change and also facilitate a green recovery from COVID-19 as we build back better. At the session I chaired on Wednesday, we heard how COVID-19 has led businesses to re-examine the resilience of their supply chains and triggered the realization that clean growth is the only type of growth which will be sustainable in the long run. Many countries are looking to liberalization of green goods and services as part of the solution to promoting renewable energy, as the UK has done through its global tariff, which liberalizes over 100 environmental goods, what we call the Green 100, which will come into force later this year. As hosts of the next UN climate conference, COP26, in 2021, we want to build on that trend, ensuring that trade plays its part in meeting the global challenge of climate change. The environment must now be thought of as integral to trade. The UN's recent Global Biodiversity Outlook report has served as a stark reminder of the risks associated with biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. Annual plastic production is still projected to double by 2035, while globally only an estimated 14 to 18% of plastics are recycled. This week's discussions have explored how trade can help break down barriers to reuse, creating markets for sustainable products, promote food security, and ingrain the need to protect the world's species. Technology is also transforming the way we trade. It's a huge opportunity. The digital transformation of the world's top 10 economies alone worth an estimated £900 billion. Global exports of services enabled by advances in ICT have more than doubled between 2005 and 2018. COVID-19 has only accelerated changes in consumer behavior. We need rules which facilitate these ever-growing forms of trade and a regulatory environment which promotes innovation and builds in trust from the outset. And we need to ensure the digital divide leaves no one behind. Yet even as the multilateral system adapts to these new developments, we must also get the basics right. As we've discussed this week, the WTO membership will need to work collectively and inclusively to address the challenges facing its core functions. It's important all parts of the WTO membership are engaged in this dialogue to ensure the system works for everyone it represents. This week has provided an excellent opportunity to hear perspectives from countries at all levels of development and from businesses of all sizes in all sectors. Speakers have reminded us of the need to integrate developing countries into global value chains and given first-hand examples of the role aid for trade plays in enabling this integration. I was especially pleased to see the relationship between trade and gender equality feature prominently in a number of the discussions this week. The commitments to support women in trade made in the Buenos Aires Declaration are as relevant as ever, and the UK looks forward to participating in the newly established WTO Working Group on Trade and Gender to advance this work. These are just some of the topics which have formed part of our enriching discussions this week. As we look forward to MC12 and beyond, we must ensure that we continue to draw in ideas from across the spectrum. That is why the UK has supported Geneva Trade Week. This week has provided a valuable opportunity for governments, businesses and civil society to come together and learn from one another in a way that's really essential for us to take forward the trade policy agenda and take it out of the sort of the dusty discussions between civil servants and bring it into the real world where we can engage the real political engagement and the engagement of businesses and the wider community necessary in order to get these agreements and get the political agreements that will take this forward. If we're to leverage the potential of international trade to support a sustainable global recovery from COVID-19, we must continue this dialogue. That's why Geneva Trade Week is going to have to become a regular event, Dmitry, by the way. We will need a diverse range of voices if we are to come up with the creative solutions needed to resolve the complex issues we face today. And it's clear from the numbers just how many people want to be part of this conversation, as I was mentioning at the beginning. At the latest count, over 3,500 people registered for Geneva Trade Week. Over 3,000 have joined the sessions on WebEx throughout the week, and almost 7,500 have watched them via live streams. Sessions have been watched in 95 countries across the world. So I'd really like to end by congratulating the team at Geneva Trade Platform on achieving this tremendous result. And these figures are really a testimony to the huge potential that digital platforms have in expanding the trade community, as we were saying. They allow us to bring new voices into the conversation and make our discussions richer and more relevant as a result. And as we were saying at the beginning, COVID-19 has made all of our lives more difficult, and we all miss being in the same room together, although I'm delighted to see at least a good number of you in the room today. But we have adapted. And when we come back together, I hope we will continue to make use of these tools and to engage and communicate across a much broader community than the one that can be physically with us in Geneva, even in the best of times. So on that note, I would like to also encourage you to sign up to the Beyond Trade Network, newly launched this week. The Beyond Trade Network is an online platform which will allow you to link up with fellow members of the trade community, find events, continue some of these important conversations. We've all hugely benefited from hearing each other's ideas this week. So my final ask is this: do not leave the conversation here. Take those ideas, the bigger the better, and start to translate them into action. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you, Geneva Trade Platform. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I couldn't think of kinder ways to summarize this conference. And certainly I think your call to action leads us perfectly into this panel, which will now look a little bit to the future and on how we can go from here towards action, towards collaboration, towards working together in a way that moves some of these tremendous challenges we've identified throughout the week forward in some of the ways that we have also identified throughout the week and beyond. And we, once again, are very grateful to you and to the Department of International Trade in the United Kingdom. You really were the spark that let us build what we've built. And so thank you very much, and for your kind words. And with that, we come to our panel on where to from here. It's exactly as I've just said. What can we do next? With me, I have some of my favorite people in trade policy, which is what you get to do when you get to design your own panel. That's one of the perks. So allow me to introduce people who largely need no introduction. First, the two co-directors of the Center for Trade and Economic Integration, within which the Geneva Trade Platform sits. Professor Joost Pauwelyn, he is a professor of international law at the Graduate Institute of Development Studies in Geneva, and the founder of Trade Lab. I've just fumbled the name of my own university. It's been a long week, guys. The Graduate Institute of Geneva. And Richard Baldwin, Professor Richard Baldwin, who's a professor of international economics, also at the Graduate Institute. Next, we have Vanessa Ragbogbo from the International Trade Center. She is the chief of the Sustainable and Inclusive Value Chains and the head of the She Trades Initiative, which I hope we get a chance to talk about today. And since I'm moderating, I strongly suspect we will. And sitting right beside me is Mr. Patrick Lowe, a fellow at the Asia Global Institute and, of course, a former WTO Chief Economist. And finally, joining us live from Washington at an frankly cruel and ungodly hour is Soumaya Keynes, the Trade and Globalization Editor at The Economist and one of the co-hosts of everyone's favorite trade podcast, Trade Talks, or as she initially referred to it, Trade__Talks, which I think is a moniker they've now dropped. So really the challenge for us today is that forward-looking vision. And before we get to it, what I'd love to do is basically to define the problem. What is the challenge we are trying to solve? How can we summarize it neatly before thinking about how to address it? And when it comes to articulating and summarizing problems, you can't do better than academics. And so I would like to start with Professor Pauwelyn, whose opening plenary focused on rethinking trade. He moderated that panel and he opened this entire conference. So I think it's fair to open with him and to ask, well, what were on the core trade issues? What came out of your plenary as in need of rethinking? Or what do you believe really needs a fundamental rethink when we think about the core ways we talk about trade or we do trade?
Okay, thank you, Dmitry, and congrats as well on an amazing week. It's all been incredibly fascinating, and I'm so glad we finished this off with thinking ahead, because we've heard from so many different people, but at the Geneva Trade Platform we want to know now what to do next and what to focus on. So I would like to pitch it in 3 points: the rethink or the big picture thinking that we can do in the Geneva Trade Platform and beyond. The first one would be at the level of what are we trying to achieve with trade policy? What should trade agreements aim for? The second question to me is, once we've set the goals, what we are aiming for, at a system level, how can we more efficiently try to achieve them? So how can we, at a system level, be more efficient? And the third one, and I really saved the third one, or I saved the WTO for last, the question of once we have set the goals and we have a system level approach, how is it that in the WTO we can implement this? And to me it's really about the mechanics, the operating system. Now the first level question of what should be the goals, that's the question I put to our opening plenary. And what I took away was nothing has changed, but everything has changed in a way. Nothing has changed because I was trying to push them, okay, is it about economic efficiency? Is it about dealing with pandemics? Is it about dignity of work? Is it about sustainability? But I think we were reminded, if you look at trade agreements and the preamble to them, from the beginning, from the 1940s, trade was set up as an instrument to achieve other goals. So not as an end in itself, right? And I really liked in Richard's panel, Richard Salmons was basically saying, we keep talking of flanking policies, social, environmental, what have you, but it's actually trade that is a flanking policy. Trade that is an instrument to achieve other higher goals of dignity of work, of sustainability, of what have you. So I think in that sense, nothing has changed. In another sense, everything has changed in that a lot of these higher goals, we've failed, right? So some of them, you can implement them domestically, a social welfare system, job protection, but we've realized now that many of these goals need cooperation. So you can't do them on your own. Think of the pandemic, think of sustainability. So everything has changed in that sense. But to me, on the first question, the main takeaway is, as trade people, we should be humble. And trade is the flanking policy to do other things, not the end goal. Now, how then, my second point of, at a system level, how can we reboot or do things differently? And I was impressed here by something that Jonathan Fried was putting on the table. He had his, it was one of the plenaries as well, he put forward his 3 C's, and one of them was collaboration. And as a former trade diplomat, he was saying, look, we too often we are navel staring, or we do things in a silo as trade diplomats. I think at the system level, a lot will have to happen within domestic policy. And I think that's where we're going. I mean, a lot of the final goals, safety nets, dignity of work, the welfare state, dealing with disruptions, it will have to happen domestically. Infrastructure, investment. But other goals will have to be pursued at the international level. Climate change, the pandemic. And there, to me, at the system level, the main challenge I see is how to collaborate. It's one of Jonathan's C's. And it sounds like obvious, but I think when the WTO is tasked to kind of reboot, and the ambassador was mentioning it as well, I don't think it's as much about further liberalization, it's about stabilizing what we have. It's about setting up new rules to deal with the digital economy, with some of the level playing fields, and to find its place in that broader system. So what are the goals? What are we trying to achieve? Secondly, how to really think about the system. And finally, what about the WTO mechanics? How can we reactivate the WTO to play its role? Here, I think Alan Wolf was on a couple of panels, and he really, and Inside US Trade reported it, he was saying we should aim for areas of consensus to really bottom-up build consensus amongst smaller groups and go from there. And I know in the WTO this is not easy, not widely accepted. We had a big session on plurilaterals, which of all countries, Brazil put together. They have kind of changed their minds on this to really push plurilaterals. And in the WTO there's plenty now, e-commerce, SMEs, investment facilitation. So I think that's happening. But that's one mechanic I think we can use more. The other one that came up in many panels is the developing status issue. And there I think shared responsibility is probably the guideline. And we see a lot of implementation of that, trade facilitation agreement and fisheries. So even though at the high level politics of things, it may be a really difficult issue, I think if you look on the ground, it's happening. And instead of dividing the members or countries into groups, there's more fine-tuning happening. Really, based on capacity, you take up responsibility. And then finally, I think, but really only finally, a lot of housekeeping internal WTO matters that need to be worked on, beefing up transparency notifications, and then getting dispute settlement back on track. And I mentioned it last because I don't think it's the main issue, but the system cannot continue to operate the way it's operating now. We have to rethink. But that's really only a final point that I would mention as kind of housekeeping within the WTO. But those would be the 3 big rethinks. What's the goal of trade policy? How to think about it at a system level, and then how to change the operating system of the WTO.
Thank you so much, Joost. I think what struck me, and this prepares us well to move to Richard, is when you talked about collaboration. Right from the start when you said, we've failed in our goals or some of the higher level goals. My first thought was, did we fail just in delivering our goals, or did we fail before that in setting them, in not being humble enough, as you said, in the goals that we set, in working with others to set them? And I guess that brings us to Professor Baldwin. Richard, you were somewhat ambushed, I would say, on your panel, which we named Trade and which then Richard Sammons, and then I think the new ITC Executive Director, Pamela Coke-Hamilton, the audience, I believe several of the sound guys, all piled in on you and said, no, it's actually and trade. Trade is the afterthought. Trade is the enabling mechanism at best. Now, that's not an easy thing for someone who's kind of built what little career I have in trade to hear, but it's absolutely right. At the end of the day, working families anywhere aren't sitting there thinking, boy, I sure do hope the trade balance improves. They're thinking about the way trade touches their lives. But I think what your panel showed was, and I think what Joost remarks confirm, is that that's not necessarily reflected in the conversation. And I wonder if you could share your impressions, both from that panel and generally, about why that is. Why are we having so much trouble being inclusive in our conversations, even horizontally at the level of very large IGOs, before we even get to vertical inclusivity when it comes to small businesses, minority groups, and so on?
Thank you for that. Yeah, and you missed, actually, you weren't up here, but Pamela Koch Hamilton and I were up here. She passed me notes written on a napkin, and we're going to write a book called ... and trade. That's I'm not sure that's a done deal yet, and there is still the subtitle to be negotiated. But it was a great thing, and it's something that actually Joost and I have actually put in a research proposal to try and talk about trade in the service of society and to view trade agreements as something more than just trade agreements. So let's hope we get that. So it was very much in line with my own thinking that I didn't know that I was thinking. So I instantly embraced it, and I thank Rick for that. That's exactly why you invite people like that onto the panel. I hope I pirouetted agilely enough to take advantage of that. But let me come to your answer, which is, why is it so hard to break down these silos? And I have 3 points, because my professors told me I should always have 3 points. And you'll notice Joost had 3 points. And there's a very good reason for that. That's because 3 points are easy to remember, easy to communicate. I've forgotten the other one. Anyways, so 3 good reasons. The first is the bureaucratic turf wars, which the students here probably haven't seen turf wars very extensively, but anybody who's worked in an organization of any size whatsoever knows that turf wars are a very, very serious thing. And it's not just a bunch of hidebound, male, stale, and pale guys looking after their career. There's very frequently much more behind it. There's very frequently financial, economic, and political interest in keeping things the way they are. For instance, telecoms in the telecom ministry. And the trade ministry can't talk about telecoms. And financial services in the treasury, and the trade guys can't talk about financial services. Because somebody has actually captured that bit of the bureaucracy or made it work for them, and they do not want to see the silos broken. So that's at least part of it. The second thing is mindsets. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the gorilla video about framing. Okay, so here's how it looks. So there's a narrator who says, there are 6 players with white t-shirts and 6 players with black t-shirts, and they're both going to be passing basketballs between each other, and you're supposed to count how many times the white shirt players pass the ball back and forth between them. And it's about 30 seconds long. And at the end of it, you ask, well, how many was it? About half the people get the answer right. And then the next question is, did you see the guy in the gorilla costume walk through the middle of the stage? And literally, there's a guy in a gorilla costume, walks through, stops, beats his chest, and then walks off the stage. And about 30% of the people didn't see the gorilla. And that's essentially what mindsets do. For 200 years, we've been using the mindset that was set up by David Ricardo, which had 2 key premises. Nations are the correct level of analysis, and only goods cross borders. And that has led a huge number of government officials, not so much businessmen, because they actually have to deal with the gorilla, but and academics and bureaucracies, politicians, whatnot, to ignore the gorilla. They think trade is goods crossing borders, and everything else is something else. And that mindset prevents seeing the connection between the problems. And I think the fact that we named the session trade and ... when it should have been ... and trade, is an example of that mindset that we have. Now, the point is that the nature of trade has become more complex. It's reaching deeper into our societies and our economies than it was before, and therefore it's affecting us in ways that never happened before. So to a certain extent, you could get away with ignoring the gorilla because it wasn't mostly that. But now it really is, and so it's important to bring it forward. And there was a third point, but you know, there's 3 types of economists. Those who can count and those who can't. Okay, now here's how it goes. I'm going to say something with emphasis and stop. And when I stop, you're supposed to laugh. Okay. My graduate students all laugh.
It's amazing what people will do. You grade their final papers. Half the audience is in here because Richard told them that this is going to be on the quiz.
So that was my answer to the silos, my serious answer to the silos. I do think it's hard to break up, but I do think it's melting a little bit. And the idea of starting back in the capitals and moving it here is one thing. I'll have some ideas about how we, the GTP, might encourage that, but I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I think you've identified a sort of bureaucratic problem, but also, in a way, a mindset problem. And mindset problems are almost always partially communications problems, which will bring us to our next speaker. But before that, I did want to make a brief announcement. In one of the 49 sessions, we have hidden a gorilla. So if whoever finds it will win a prize. So feel free to just all give us thousands of stream views as you search for this gorilla. The prize will be great. Richard will determine and award it. But no, that brings us to our next speaker, as I want to move from identifying the problem to begin thinking about some of the solutions, or at least some of the ingredients of the solutions. And for this, I'm very glad we have Soumaya Keynes here. Soumaya is in some ways unique as a trade journalist because of the medium she operates in. The Economist is not a daily magazine, it's not an hourly, it's not a reaction magazine. And the medium of Trade Talks, her podcast, is also not something that you can fire back on a recent development with. So inevitably, whenever Soumaya writes or whenever Soumaya produces a podcast, she has to find a way to make something interesting, even perhaps 4 or 5 days after it happens, to take that half step back, think about the context of why it matters, and why it matters to an audience as broad as the one that reads The Economist or the one that listens to Trade Talks, which is not a small clique of trade nerds, to put it mildly. So I really wanted to having her here and having woken her up so early, I wanted to, okay, her face is behind me. She's looming over us like an angry and slightly sleep-deprived god. Soumaya, what can we as the trade community, the broader sort of trade, I think Rick Simmons called us the cognoscenti, which certainly doesn't describe me. I don't even know what it means. What can we do to communicate our issues in a way that can help reshape the political discourse among it, make it more inclusive, perhaps to solve some of those challenges Joost identified, to begin to change some of those mindsets that Richard identified? Basically, how do you do it?
Okay, right, and I will now present all of the answers in 3 points, as that's also the number of points my editors demand of me when economist leaders always have the 3 points. Okay, so I sit in as you said, I sit in a strange place, right? I'm incredibly privileged in terms of the audiences I get to communicate to. I think I'm probably lying if I say that Trade Talks has as broad an audience as The Economist. I'm able to go into much more detail in Trade Talks than I am in The Economist, just because my editors don't want to give me 20 minutes worth of content every single week in the paper. So So I have these specific audiences, and I sit in Washington DC, right? And so I kind of notice my view is very distorted by the US discussion. That's the thing I have most experience of. And I can kind of identify some challenges there that could be ripe for to sort of address, perhaps from the Geneva Trade Platform's point of view. So I think one is, I guess, is what we were talking about, diversity of voices, right? At the moment, there's a handful of pale, male, and stale people who are very, very easy for me to reach, who are always willing to give me some kind of comment. It can be a bit more challenging because of implicit bias, established networks, and so on, to get hold of voices who aren't the easy ones, right? So who aren't American, and who don't fit within a certain demographic. And so here I would really commend the work of the trade experts to sort of try and diversify the pool of voices in that way. And I'm sure there's scope for other efforts like that, given the lack of diversity along other dimensions. I think my second point would be, I guess, to think about the way that we communicate. I think there's one sort of government that I've spoken to that has been burned by various protests in the past when things became a bit too controversial. And one response to that is to say, you know what, it's time to make things a bit more boring again. We all spent years, crying out for trade to be higher up on the agenda. Now it is higher up on the agenda. We're not actually so comfortable with that. It's not in the way that we wanted it. And so now, if we do agree anything, let's just make sure it's as dry and technical as possible, so that no one could sort of notice that we're doing anything that matters. That's quite a risky strategy, obviously, as it effectively, hands the narrative over to other people to make. And so I guess there's I would call for a bit more introspection in terms of how we communicate, how we talk about trade issues. So just to give a couple of examples, as the kinds of things that I hear that we could think about. So one is, policy X is proposed. Retort is, well, that doesn't meet the WTO rules. And we all see why that's a problem, right? But it's kind of understandable as to why that doesn't really explain to most normal people why it's a problem, right? And so there's why does it break the WTO rules, and why should we care about the WTO rules? Do we think that discrimination is bad? That kind of thing. I think going that next step is important, and obviously there are people watching this who will be interacting with journalists and kind of explaining to them that why it's breaking the WTO rules and why the rules are good in the first place is a worthwhile thing to explain. I think on some things, there's a lot of chat about data and digital trade agreements, and I think there's an example where it's possible to try to be a bit more concrete about why companies in a developing country would benefit from those rules. And if it's very, very difficult to explain why, do you have to ask whether the critics have a point about where the particular benefits are one-sided, right? It should be possible to explain these things clearly, and so let's all try harder with that. My final point, I suppose, is just on a more general point about communications, right? So there was a recent piece in the FT that was very good and made the point that the rules-based international order doesn't exactly set the heart racing, and I would concur. And so I think there are two. So one needs to be really realistic about who one is communicating to. But the reality is that most communication to the masses happens through established gatekeepers. It's very, very difficult to break through that. That said, if as an individual, as an institution, you've decided you really want to communicate something about trade and reshape the debate, then there are basically two ways to do it. You can do it as an individual and just go to Dmitry's Twitter feed. It's hilarious. That's just kind of a good strategy if you want to be noticed, and he is. Or if you're an institution, have a look at the Jamaican Central Bank and the videos they put out about monetary policy. They're fun. They're pretty funny. They're not a kind of, earnest take on. Just go and have a look. You'll see what I mean. They're quite different in flavor to standard institutional communications, and people love it. And so basically more funny videos, and I could say more podcasts, but that would mean more competition for me. So I'm not very interested in that recommendation. But yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to unpack there. I think the thing that struck me the most out of what you said was around communicating complexity. And the fact that I think sometimes we in the trade community look at something that we are super in the weeds on, and that where actually the complexity is kind of what we love about it, because that's where sort of the art comes into it beyond the science. And we love that, and we look at it and we say, listen, this is just far too complicated for any normal human being to understand. We won't even try. And my reaction to that has always been that if someone can understand the leg before wicket rule in cricket, there is nothing in trade that will frighten them in terms of complexity. I grew up in Australia and I still don't get it. So often, all we have to do is explain the core of an issue, the interest of an issue, and we can break through. And I hope some of the content we've produced and that the organizers have produced during the week have kind of taken steps in that direction. We very deliberately ask people to focus on the general public and to communicate that way. So thank you very much, Soumaya. We'll definitely come back to you in a moment. I wanted to move to my left, to the venerable Patrick Lowe. He hasn't got his mic in his hand, so you can't hear him make fun of me. But something I'm really cognizant of, given that I live on the internet, is that roughly every 3 weeks or so, Silicon Valley will reinvent the bus. They will announce a bold new initiative, which is just like Uber, but it stops at regular stops and carries 30 people. And you're like, you've just reinvented the bus, guys. So it's really easy to come into a space like this as a new institution like we are, and to pitch bold new ideas that have actually been tried before and that stand on the shoulders of giants. And Patrick, you've been in this town for longer than I have. I wonder, are there initiatives that really, really worked to address some of these challenges in the past that you wish we could bring back? Are there initiatives you always wanted to see, but it never quite came together?
Thank you, Dmitry. Did you ask me this question to shorten the session?
This is a session with two professors on it. There's no chance of shortening it.
Well, that's the point, yes. Because, quite honestly, I have to scratch my head. If I were to try to look for anything, it would be things that the WTO has tried to do in a multi-stakeholder context. And the obvious one is on the development side. Not the battle over the balance of rights and obligations in the system, but actually trying to support the capacity, capabilities to participate more meaningfully in trade. So the whole aid for trade kind of approach, I think there have been some real benefits for some countries from this. I think there have been some non-trivial benefits for consultants from the countries that are providing the money. Richard, I know the feeling when they don't, yeah? I think this should have been much more demand-driven than it has been. Not enough buy-in and not enough early stage involvement from the putative beneficiaries. So I think that, but that I would point to. Joost wanted me to mention the Advisory Center for WTO Law as an example of something that has been tried and actually, from what I know, but I don't know much about it, is working. Joost can probably tell you about that. And more especially, he wanted me to mention the trade labs. So I've done it, okay? Now, the thing is, I just wanted to take up, if you just indulge me a little bit, I think we're going a little bit too far by calling trade a flanking policy. I think it's reductionist and not terribly meaningful. You can be not an end in yourself as something like trade, but it doesn't mean you're a flanker. Trade can be an enabler or a wrecker. Depends how it functions. Trade is part and parcel of a complex. The problem that we've had in the past is that we've tried to think of trade, too many people for too long have tried to think of it as an end in itself. It clearly isn't. Sustainability is an end in itself, but you can surely mess up sustainability objectives by not getting trade right. So let's just call it flanking. Let's give it its rightful place. I think the other problem here is that the WTO as an institution has either, on its own account, assumed too much responsibility for things it cannot control, or has got foisted on it things that it really doesn't have much control over. And I think frankly, it's a mixture of both. So I think that institutionally speaking, if we talk about how to do the and trade and agenda, we're going to have to think about the architecture, much more carefully about the architecture. And frankly, that's why I think this newly named platform called the Geneva ... and Trade Platform should really find its natural role in bringing those stakeholders together, bringing those interests together, not pretending that there's a kind of obvious hierarchy. It depends on the issue as to what really drives it. And I think that's actually quite an important thing not to lose sight of. I mean, we have for too long heard people say that we've got to do trade because trade's right and trade's good for you, trade makes you healthy, and it's obviously an end in itself. Clearly not. But that doesn't mean you can relegate it to flanking. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you, Patrick. I just want to let people know that Patrick is available to plug your products with the same level of enthusiasm and fidelity to their branding that he just delivered here. Don't all blow up his phone during this conference. But I think there's certainly a lot there. The Aid for Trade initiative at the WTO was not necessarily something that was envisaged in 94 or 95, but it's now an absolutely core part of the work. The Global Review of Aid for Trade is an absolutely pivotal moment in every second year calendar, and there's a lot of really important work being done. And sort of on that Aid for Trade front, and also on the sort of scale of the challenges front, I wanted to go to our final speaker, Vanessa. Now, Vanessa, through She Trades, you guys have tackled a problem that is so vast, the participation of women in trade on an equal footing. You have tackled a problem of immense scope. You've done it with limited resources, and you've done it from Geneva. Obviously, for us at the Geneva Trade Platform, all of those things resonate quite a bit, as it's certainly we're staring that challenge dead in the face too. So I wonder, what can you share with us straight away from your experiences of turning that into the juggernaut that it is today, in terms of what should we know and what perhaps in your experience resonates with some of the challenges that Joost and Richard, and I think Patrick and Soumaya as well, have identified?
Thank you very much, Dmitry, for putting me as the final speaker on the final panel of such an incredible week during lunch break on a rainy Geneva afternoon. So I will do my best to address your question. And I think one of the things, I liked what you said, Richard, about mindset. And the world, I think, is very lucky to have someone like me who has zero concentration span. It often doesn't work for me, but I would probably see the gorilla. So I think this mindset that we come to things with, seeing the gorilla, having the belief that, half a century ago we put a man on the moon, so nothing is really impossible. I think is a really important driver of the success that we've had. And I can see that you're off to a really great start, building that car as you're driving it and getting the platform up and running, getting this week up and running. Congratulations on such great results already. So I have 3 points, like my fellow panelists on this side of the room, and I even have a 4th potential point if I can fill in for Richard, who lost his 3rd point. My first point was, and I really enjoyed listening to the discussions about ... and trade, because one of the first things that we did was we took a very purpose-driven, people-centered approach to how we wanted to do things. So, we changed the goal from increasing the participation of women in trade to increasing the benefits that they derive from their participation in trade. And I think, to go a step even further, since you want solutions, I think that we actually already have a very useful tool that can help us do that in the trade landscape, and that's the Sustainable Development Goals, which we already built consensus around, which 193 UN member states have agreed to, and which gives us that sort of system level approach and framework that's been agreed and allows us this platform for collaboration. Actually, if you look at the Buenos Aires Declaration, for example, where 127 members, WTO members, signed up, even the countries that did not sign up tend to place the SDGs very high in their priority and are taking actions on the commitments agreed in the Buenos Aires Declaration. So you see that, there are other channels that can be pursued. My second point, and Soumaya picked up on that actually, was on diversity. And I strongly believe that solutions can only be valuable if they're based on the closest understanding of what reality is. And to do that, you need to bring in diverse voices. And one of my bugbears on these discussions and panels is, we say, okay, let's bring someone in from a developing country, and we say, bring in an SME. But actually, there are lots of experts from developing countries who we need to bring in to drive the debate and to drive the conversation here. And then third, I think something that I really hope that the platform will be thinking about is future-proofing. Future-proofing to anticipate the future, to develop ways to minimize, future shocks, to, build some resilience into the multilateral trading system. Think about the pandemic. It shouldn't have come as a shock. Scientists have predicted this for the longest time. 10 years ago, even, books have been published that have talked about a pandemic that's very, very similar to the one that we're facing, but we seem to have been caught by surprise. Imagine how different the response could have been if we had done some future-proofing of the multilateral trading system. And that's something that we do all the time. We're constantly anticipating what the future might look like, building in resilience, and I think the flip side of that is also building in preparedness to capitalize on future opportunities. So we need to move from adapting to the challenges of the day, as Julian had mentioned, and I challenge us to do this, to anticipating the challenges of the future. So what might trade rules look like if bees have gone extinct and agricultural production is severely impacted? Or what might trade look like if the ice cap melts and there's a new shipping route? So these are, I think, the types of discussions that we should be having. And then, if I'm allowed, I'm going to borrow Richard's third point. Thank you. and share some ancillary thoughts that have just come up. And one is bringing people along. So I think one of the reasons that you've been so successful already this week is that you've been able to partner with lots of people and bring people along. Second was on communications, really simplifying the message and being able to make the issues accessible to anyone, because these issues matter to all of our lives, including the lives of the farmers that we're working with in West Africa and their communities who've been so severely impacted by not being able to sell their cashew crop this year, you know? So this is what I wanted to contribute to the debate. Thank you. And lunch, I hope, next time.
I think a critical lesson from this conference is that either the US or Asia really need to move time zones, because accommodating both from Europe is just impossible. And we force people to wake up early and lose out on lunch. Thank you very much for that, Vanessa. I assure you, you are only the last speaker on the last panel, because this is how we want to be remembered. I'm very comfortable with this being the last image people have of Geneva Trade Week, rather than my silly face. But I think you raised a lot of really important points about, and I want to focus on future-proofing and throw it back to Soumaya, actually, because one of the future-proofing points Vanessa didn't raise, but which I think is critically important, is around populism. And I think perhaps the future-proofing around that could have taken place 15 years ago to be truly useful. But it certainly doesn't seem like a problem that's going away. And I guess the question I had for Soumaya, especially in terms of communication and in terms of informing the debate and not necessarily countering populism, but elevating the debate that populism can sometimes hijack, is sometimes it feels like we set for ourselves the challenge of convincing the diehards, the people who are deeply engaged and have a populist perspective. Is that achievable, or is there a middle ground of people that we should be aiming to speak to bring into the discussion, to broaden its base? And if so, how should we be communicating with them? How do we break through the noise of the loudest voices? And just before I throw you the microphone, just want to remind our audience, the Q&A box is open. We will definitely take your questions. My team will signal and wave their hands frantically at me if there are questions to throw to the panel. Soumaya, please.
Okay, so it's too early for me to have coffee or breakfast, so just like include that caveat. Right. So, so the question is, should we be trying to win over the diehards, or should we be going for the center ground? I mean, I guess I could go back to what I said before, and to be quite realistic about who you are communicating to, right? So, to be brutally honest, I'm skeptical that, you know, anyone like, you know, my mum, or I'm skeptical that there are many normal people who aren't in the trade wonk space are going to sit through an hour-and-a-half long webinar about, you know, carbon border adjustment taxes, right? And so there's a question of kind of what's the medium, right? So so in webinars, I kind of often assume that the people I'm speaking to are the people who are kind of weird and wonky and wonderful enough to want to listen to a 1.5 hour long webinar, and so I actually don't often feel like I'm communicating to the masses when I do that, right? Because so then there's a question of you know, so how do you, right, so there's a finite amount of energy that we all have, right? And if the question is, where do you spend that finite energy? Do you try and convince the people who aren't convinced? Or do you try and change minds of people who are? I suspect, you know, I doubt there are many Joe Biden videos trying to persuade diehard Trump voters that they should really vote for Biden. You know, in terms of pure strategy, you go for the swing. I guess there's a risk in that you end up not confronting the arguments that people on the populist side are making. I think one does need to confront those. I feel like in the debate sometimes there's a temptation to pick the worst arguments that the opposition are making and to fight against those. So let's just to take an example, in the US, the Trump administration is very, very upset about bilateral trade deficits, right? Which is a pretty easy thing for economists to say, bilateral deficits don't matter. Now, it's actually more challenging to say that overall trade deficits don't matter at all, right? But whenever that question comes up, we kind of go back to the bilateral trade deficits don't matter. This is, economically illiterate, right? But by kind of permanently going back to the bilateral trade deficits thing, we're kind of not having an argument. We're sort of we're not engaging with something that's actually quite important, and it's tough to explain, but I think is worth doing. So when we're having these conversations, I think we should always just ask which arguments are we not responding to and why, and just to be really, really clear that if we're not engaging with something, we're engaging it because actually we have finite energy and we need to persuade these guys, and not that we're not engaging with it because actually it's a better argument than we'd like to admit, and it's just a bit tricky to engage with.
I think there's a huge amount of truth to that. I know certainly a lot of social media really does reward the easy dunk. You find the one thing that you can declare as categorically untrue or silly, and you point that out in a sort of scathing way, and the dopamine hits come in as the retweets and likes fly. But often you're leaving the underlying core issue unaddressed. You're picking out the one flaw that's easy to pick apart. So I certainly think there's a lot of truth to that. And I wonder if kind of on that score and on the score of communication generally, I could go back to Joost actually, because I was positioning there the debate or the discussion of diehards and everybody else. But as I was doing that, it's something that you said in our earlier Ask the Expert session came to me, which is that there is a third group. Maybe Soumaya's mum, who I assume is watching today, and hello, your daughter's doing a fantastic job. But so certainly someone who feels they're completely disconnected from trade is not someone we can readily reach with a 1.5 hour webinar or possibly even a 5-minute video. But there is a whole band of people who are engaged in trade or who are affected by trade in a really direct way, who are still, I think, disconnected and not likely to engage in perhaps an 1.5 hour long webinar. So how do should we be talking to those people? How do we reach those people, especially in and around trade law and trade policy issues, which I know are the kind of thing that Trade Lab works on? Your clients aren't just hardcore wonks.
Dmitry, we'll have to have a talk about you pronouncing my first name. But we can do that afterwards. I'm not giving up. But I want to bring it back to our Geneva Trade Platform and think about exactly how to implement this. I liked your image of we are building a car while we are driving it, and it's a little bit that. So, and people online with us, if you have ideas on how to communicate, how to do this, how to reach that third group who isn't even aware that trade matters to their lives. I think we did quite well this week by being more inclusive. I mean, the numbers are impressive, right? And I was switching from one panel to the other. A few of them were completely in Spanish. Then others were coming in from India, the Caribbean. So I think that's great. But I don't, of course, we have to improve. We can do better than this. We had some Ask the Expert sessions. We had some networking sessions. But I don't know how we can leverage that online world we now have to reach those people who are not even aware that what we are discussing matters to them. So if people have ideas on how to perfect the hybrid system we followed, how to better reach out. I mean, the other thing that I've been really impressed with this week is how we've been able, on a relatively small budget, to build a great website, although it was only up like the day before we kicked it off. But if you look at it now, I think it's amazing. Plus offering interpretation in French, Spanish, English, and all of that using, as you were saying in the beginning, really picking providers that can supply this for really low amounts. And so I think we'll have to innovate on the platform and think creatively about new ideas of how to reach out. Because I find it fascinating. I've been in this for 20, 25 years, and I feel like we're doing something novel, something new, but we are far from really where we want to be. So we're still building that car. And I would love for people who have been following the week to come in with their ideas and innovations on how to do better.
Thank you, Professor. He said, taking the coward's way out. Vanessa, on this subject of doing better, you look like you have thoughts. So I'm not even going to ask you a question. I'm just going to throw you the microphone and give you the floor.
Thanks very much. I think just two things came to mind, and I'll start with this issue of reaching more people. In the words of Michael Gove, we've had enough of experts. So a really good way is to get the voices from the people to talk about this. So go out in the field, get people in Central African Republic talking about Geneva Trade Platform, get farmers talking in Fiji talking about it. You know, try and find these voices of the people who it affects and less of the experts talking about it. So that was came immediately to mind. But I also, you know, in reflecting on all of this, and this is a very random thought that doesn't fit in anywhere, I think it's important that we have very honest conversations, because there are losers, there are winners, and you know, and this is the way that it will be. And I think it's more about focusing on, you know, what's fair, or where do the losses deserve to come from when we're talking about, you know, transitioning to a green economy or redistributing the value in the cocoa value chain, or, you know, there will be losers and there will be winners. But if we can just keep moving generally in a positive direction and moving as many people as we can move, then I think that's success.
Thank you, Vanessa. In the spirit of not throwing to and not putting an expert front and center, I have the Wto Chief Economist as my next speaker, which somewhat hamstrings me on this panel, because I'm going to have to throw to an expert. But I did have a question, which you are free to ignore, as you do most of the things I say, Patrick, and just share your own thoughts. But if you did want a question to start you off, we've been talking a lot about the general public and perhaps the trade-engaged public. But I think something you brought up in your earlier intervention was about WTO architecture. And that is kind of a field for experts and delegates. It's a specialized field. I wonder if there is support that they need, or communications that can reach them, that in your experience of having been surrounded by delegates for so many years jumps out at you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an awful lot that could be done. I remember getting into a bit of a fight back in the day when we had a publication called something like 10 Reasons Why Trade is Good for You, or something like that. So, you know, that we've moved away from that, I hope, a little bit. But we don't have nearly enough intellectual honesty and engagement in questions about what it is the WTO thinks it's supposed to do and what it's supposed to stand for. And I think there's a lot that could be done in more accessible discussions about, well, it's a little bit what Soumaya was saying, what is non-discrimination, why? Is trade always good for me? Sometimes is it bad for me? What else do I need besides trade if I want to benefit from trade? I don't think we have those kinds of discussions. We've never had those kinds of discussions. We've been too tied to the old idea that we have to promote trade and in the worst form, trade is always good for you. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do there.
Thank you, Patrick. I might now throw to Professor Baldwin. I mean, you've written an awful lot about how, I suppose, the economy is changing through the globotics upheaval and through the redistribution of supply chains around the world. Do you think that there is a niche and need for that entire process to be better explained, especially in the way that regulations and borders and the decisions that governments make shape what that will mean for the people on the ground who ultimately this is all about?
First, let me start off with toast. It rhymes with toast. Joost. It's very easy. Now, and I notice you avoided saying my first name too, Richard. That one's an easy one. Okay, and thank you for plugging my books. I really do appreciate that. And do we need it? Yes, I've been working on it since 2006, and people still don't get it. But that's not what I really want to talk about now. What I want to talk about is the trade conversation. And I would use 3 words. No, actually it's 4 words, but one of them's contracted. So don't explain, widen. Don't explain, widen. President Eisenhower, as Rick Sammons reminded us, said, if you have a really difficult, big, thorny problem, the way to solve it is often by making it bigger. And let me just give you a little personal anecdote. I graduated university a few years after the crust of the earth cooled, a little bit before the dinosaurs. And I learned about computers by programming in Fortran. And for many years, I was actually the techie guy. But now, Apple, Microsoft, Google, I cannot make them work together. It's just too complicated. I have several accounts on each one, and each one's linked to other ones. But it's so important to me now that I actually put the effort into fixing it. So if you want people to pay attention enough to trade so that they actually understand what's going on, you have to make it clear that it matters to them. And once it matters to them, like the leg before the wicket rule, they may spend the time they actually need to do it. So actually, I think ITC is a very good example. And the things that Pamela Coke-Hamilton was saying yesterday, she was saying stuff like, wow, we got to pay attention to this. This really matters. This isn't about alphabet soup and technical barriers to trade and phytosanitary standards and things like that. It really matters. So that's the way I would go with it. The idea, I think, is that we should try and mainstream the ... That perhaps what we should do is embrace a policy or a philosophy of trade policy in the service of society, which has an acronym of TPIS. But then I thought maybe it should be trade policy in the service of humanity. Then it would be TTIS. Is that okay? Anyways, we'll
workshop it.
We'll work on it. Okay. But that's the point, is I think if we can convince people that really matters to their everyday life, and that's what I've been saying with my book, is the trade system and international commerce and economic cooperation are reaching more deeply into our economies, into the factories, into the workplaces, more than before. Trade actually matters in that. So we don't explain trade, we explain how we can make your life better, and trade is part of that. And I think once we raise the level of attention and visibility of the issue, we'll be able to make some progress. Let me just start with one thing. If President Biden wins, he will have a tendency to forget about trade for 4 years, like Obama did, because the Democrats are split. But if somehow you can convince the Democratic president that this really matters for everything, for climate change, for industrialization, for the lives of workers, for a balance of inclusiveness all around the world, then trade may get on the agenda. So I can see Dmitry is panicking, but I'll just stop there. We can keep going.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Joost. I think the executive director of ITC appreciates the way you've already started plugging the book you two haven't written yet. We do have some questions from the audience at home. I'm going to throw to Juanita, who will read them out with flawless diction.
Thank you. No pressure. We have a question for Patrick Law. What did you mean by creating a new architecture in the rules? And then we had another question for Joost Pauwelyn. I really emphasized it this time, didn't I? Which rules did you mention that can be tackled on an international level and which on a domestic? How can the trade rules architecture change?
We have 7 minutes, gentlemen, so I beg you to tackle those very small questions briefly.
Yeah, it is a very small question. I think what I really had in mind with the architecture was that a lot of the way the trade rules are formulated is basically looking at how you can make sure that trade is transparent, that trade is non-discriminatory. All these things are fine, but I think we also need to have more sensitivity in the rules to the circumstances in which you may not think that these are optimal approaches to making policy. We have it a little bit in the whole discussion about the balance of rights and obligations in the system, but I don't think we have enough sensitivity to the way we think about, for example, when you say in the provisions which are kind of for public policy, okay, it's almost grudging. You can do this, but you can really only do this under very special circumstances. I'm not going to go technical on it, but the Brazil ties is a great example of why that problem arose. So I think the architecture is just to make it more embracing, a little bit like what Richard was saying, enlarge the problem, make people understand that it isn't just about optimizing trade policy. That's what I meant.
Thank you, Patrick. Joost?
So what I was trying to get at is division of labor between the domestic level and the international level. So although I'm an international lawyer and here at the Graduate Institute we do international studies, I think you should only go there when you cannot solve the problem domestically. So things like social welfare, health insurance, job security, infrastructure, those are things, security I guess you would do domestically, but then anything that has a spillover, and trade is one of those, trade restrictions, climate change, pandemics, there I would go international. But I think perhaps we are kind of starting too often or too quickly trying to do international things and forgetting that the domestic level can, in many cases, do the trick. But then when we do go international, and I guess that's what Patrick was also referring to, we have to question, okay, what do we do in the WTO and what do we do elsewhere, and then how do we get them to work together?
Thank you very much. We have just 5 minutes left, so I'd like to give you each a chance, 30 seconds or a minute. What I may have neglected to mention at the start is that everyone on this stage and Soumaya in DC are part of the Geneva Trade Platform family. Vanessa, Patrick, and Soumaya are on our board of advisors. In fact, at the moment, they are our board of advisors. And of course, Joost and Richard are our strategic directors of the CTI under which we sit. So if I could just ask you for just one thought each. Richard, you can give your second and third points to Vanessa and Patrick. One thought each of what is your ambition for the platform? If we could do anything, what would you like to see us do? And I might put Richard on the spot first.
Okay, so that's easy. Listen to other people. That the demand for the platform should come from people putting up real issues to address, rather than we create a top-down kind of agenda. So my ambition is that when people have a good idea, they come to us because we can get it done, we can get it discussed in a neutral, safe area.
Thank you. That is certainly my ambition as well. Vanessa, you are the busiest person in Geneva, and yet you somehow agreed to do this. I'm fairly certain it wasn't my personal charm that talked you into it. So what did you see in it?
A bit of your charm, but also an opportunity to break down silos, I think, and to really bring lots of voices together to come up with a system approach. You know, I'm a big believer in, you know, going big. I don't do incremental. And I think that there's that right now we need big. And right now, there's a real gap in any center of gravity where that's going to lead that doing big. And I thought that, you know, GTP housed here at the Graduate Institute could provide a really great platform to really do big system, you know, breaking silos type of stuff. So no pressure. I'm
never going to get to sleep, am I? Speaking of not sleeping, Soumaya, can I throw that same question at you? A DC-based journalist who also has absolutely no time on her hands, isn't necessarily a natural fit for the Geneva Trade Platform, and yet you said yes when I begged and pleaded.
Yeah, 100% due to your charm. Yeah, so actually, what I hope, and this may not please many of you to hear, I hope that the Geneva Trade Platform will make Geneva less important. So it's kind of great and amazing that I can talk to you from DC. I think there's a perception that, you know, you really have to be in the room and suffer the jet lag and travel all the way to Geneva. And I think, you know, in this post-pandemic world, I hope that, you know, these fora will allow us to broaden the discussion and to talk to each other in ways that we weren't able to before. We just didn't, because we had Geneva, because we had all that meeting in person. Actually, there was the accident that you ended up excluding some people who couldn't make it. So I hope that the Geneva Trade Platform is actually less geographically contained than perhaps the discussion was before.
Thank you. I think for our part, we want to make the idea of Geneva, I suppose, what Geneva offers as a communing space. We want to put that front and center, and we want to make it more accessible to the world. So rather than diminishing Geneva, we want to, I suppose, to use the phrase, don't explain, widen. We want to widen what Geneva offers the trade policy community. But your point is 100% right, and I hope that's what we've done through Geneva Trade Week, by making it something you can participate in without a hotel on Rue de Lausanne. So with that, as Patrick is giving me quite a dirty look, I will hand it over to him.
No dirty looks. I think this making Geneva less important is a lot of that, at least in the short term, is about the COVID dividend. This is the first time we try to organize something as complex as this virtually, and actually it could have been 100% virtual almost. It's nice to have hybrid, but that the virtual part is the key, I think, to that. This platform, I think, was really born with the idea that it would be demand-driven, that essentially it would be a place where people with interests in these matters, stakeholders of all descriptions, could come, could create an environment in which these things could be discussed virtually as well. The challenge, of course, is that you'd have all these facilities and nobody comes. So what you have to try and find is the right mix between having the possibility of letting people do what they want to do, but also, at some level, also animating it. And I think that is a challenge, but I think that the success of the platform will turn in no small measure on how well that mix can be achieved, so that people do really feel that they're welcome, whatever their views, but at the same time, you don't have empty rooms like the Geneva International Conference Center. Very nice rooms, but mostly empty.
Thank you, Patrick. And Joost, your final thoughts.
Okay, well, come to think of it, Geneva Trade Platform has 3 words. And I do think to put Soumaya at ease, when we picked Geneva, the idea was really to bring Geneva to the world and the world to Geneva. Definitely our goal on the trade in Geneva Trade Platform. I think it came out completely in this session that we really want to go beyond trade, also the Beyond Trade network. And then the platform it's perhaps something we haven't stressed enough. So our aim is not to build a high-rise, brick and mortar with many people. It really is a platform. And the way we did this week exemplifies it. So I don't think we were front and center. We were kind of in the background and worked with partners, Cato, IISD, and other partners to make it happen. So very excited, and we really want to go for it. Before I give the mic back to you, I'd like to thank you, Dmitry, for putting this all together. I mean, those of you who did know Dmitry, you've seen his wit, his charm, his convincing power to put people on the board to set all of this up. We've only recently hired you with the task of setting up the Geneva Trade Week and now build the car that is already at full speed. So, and I think we couldn't have thought of anyone better. So thank you so much for your work and all your energy in the last week. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Well, how does one follow that? I have a few skills, but accepting praise is certainly not among them. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you. We are now over time, and I consider that to be a crime punishable by the Geneva Convention, which is thankfully right down the road. So let me just offer one final concluding thought. We were able to do this entire conference, which it feels like people valued and enjoyed, in 2 months, on a budget of less than, I believe, 150,000 euros, with a team that can all fit into my office. We want to do really great things, and we want to do it exactly through all of the things our board members and our co-directors have just mentioned, by being listening, by being inclusive, and through those partnerships that Vanessa talked about. So come reach out to us, work with us, partner with us, join us on the Beyond Trade network, make use of us. We have 2 ambitions, and that is to be inclusive and to be useful. Thank you so much for making Geneva Trade Week a success. We hope you find it useful, and until next time, thank you.